A bleeding German shepherd stands in the middle of a Colorado highway and she won't move. Traffic backs up. Engines idle. A deputy responds expecting roadkill. What he finds instead is a dog with a name that stops his heart, his dead brother's name engraved on her collar. But she's not there by accident. She's waiting. Waiting for someone to follow her. Because beneath 3 feet of January snow, something is crying. Something that shouldn't be alive. This dog traveled 2 miles while bleeding internally with fractured ribs through sub-zero temperatures. Not to escape. To lead someone back to what was buried, back to what someone tried to erase. A cardboard box, a man with a boot, and 23 minutes without a heartbeat. This isn't just a rescue story. This is about a mother who refused to let her babies disappear. About a deputy who'd given up on saving anyone. And about the moment when a dog standing in the middle of a highway forced the world to witness what it tried to bury. Her name was Luna, and what she did on that frozen January morning would expose a pattern of cruelty, rewrite 2 broken lives, and prove that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to disappear. This is her story, and it starts with a deputy kneeling in the snow, digging with bare hands, racing against time, because somewhere beneath the ice, 3 newborn hearts are still fighting. The question is, will he find them before it's too late? Stay with us because this story will leave you speechless. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. On January 14, 2023, under a bright Colorado winter sun that turned snowdrifts into fields of crushed diamonds, a bleeding German shepherd stood in the middle of State Highway 9, and she refused to let the officer leave. Traffic backed up in both directions, engines idling, exhaust clouds hanging in the frozen air. Deputy Ryan Holbrook had responded to the call expecting roadkill or maybe an injured deer stumbling from the tree line. What he found instead was a dog with eyes that held something he recognized, something that made his chest tighten before he even stepped out of the cruiser. The shepherd didn't growl, didn't bark. She simply stood there in the westbound lane, her dark coat matted with blood along her shoulder and left flank, her gaze locked on Ryan's windshield as if she'd been waiting specifically for him. Ryan activated his light bar and positioned the cruiser to block traffic. The cold hit him the moment he opened the door, that particular January cold that found every gap in clothing and settled into bones. He approached slowly, one hand extended, his boots crunching on road salt and scattered gravel. The dog didn't move. Her breathing came in visible puffs, shallow and controlled. When Ryan got within 10 feet, he saw the collar, worn leather with a brass tag that caught the sunlight. He knelt, keeping his movements deliberate and calm, the way his brother Daniel had taught him years ago when they were kids bringing home strays. The tag read Sheet. Daniel Mitchell Memorial Unit, K9 Luna, Handler, Sarah Mitchell. Ryan's hand stopped mid-reach. Daniel Mitchell, his brother's name, engraved on a dog collar, worn by a shepherd bleeding in the middle of a highway 4 years after Daniel's death in a training accident that left Ryan an only child and their parents with a folded flag they couldn't look at. The grief hit like it always did, sudden and sharp, a blade between ribs. He forced air into his lungs and refocused. This dog, Luna, wasn't random. Someone had named her after his brother, someone who knew. But there was no time to process that now because Luna moved, finally, turning away from Ryan and limping toward the shoulder of the road. Her left hind leg dragged slightly, leaving a faint trail of blood on the asphalt. She glanced back once, a look so deliberate Ryan felt it in his gut, then continued toward the snowbank piled high from the plows. Ryan followed. He called dispatch for animal control and backup, but Luna was already at the snow's edge, pawing at the frozen mound with her right front paw, her breath coming faster now, more urgent. Then Ryan heard it, faint, barely audible over the hum of idling engines and the wind moving through the pines. A newborn cry, thin and desperate, coming from beneath the snow. Luna looked at him one more time, and Ryan understood. She wasn't hurt from an accident. She'd been fighting. And whatever she'd been fighting for was buried under 3 feet of January snow. Ryan dropped to his knees and began to dig. The cry wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was alive, and that was enough to send Ryan's hands moving faster through the snow, his gloves soaked through in seconds, fingers going numb as he clawed at the compacted ice. Luna stood beside him, her injured leg trembling, her breath coming in short bursts that crystallized in the air. She didn't make a sound. Just watched, her dark eyes tracking every movement of Ryan's hands as if measuring whether he understood the urgency. The first thing Ryan felt was fabric, something soft and synthetic, a fleece blanket maybe, frozen into a rigid shell. He pulled harder, breaking through layers of ice and powder until his fingers found warmth underneath, impossible warmth in the middle of all that cold. He yanked the blanket free and there they were. 3 puppies, tangled together in a heap of fur and shallow breathing, their tiny bodies pressed so close they looked like a single organism struggling to survive. 2 were moving weakly, their mouths opening and closing in silent cries. The third lay still. Ryan stripped off his coat and wrapped the puppies inside, pulling them against his chest where his body heat could reach them. Luna pressed her muzzle against the bundle, sniffing each one, a low whine escaping her throat. Ryan's mind raced. Someone had buried them. This wasn't accidental. The blanket, the location just off the highway shoulder, the depth of the snow covering them. This was deliberate. He scanned the area, his training kicking and despite the adrenaline screaming through his veins. Fresh boot prints led from the road to the snowbank, then back again. Size 11, maybe 12. Deep treads, the kind construction workers wore. The prints were no more than an hour old, still sharp-edged, not yet softened by wind or fresh snow. Whoever did this was close, maybe still watching. Ryan carried the puppies to his cruiser, Luna limping beside him, refusing to leave their side. He cranked the heat and radioed for emergency veterinary support, his voice steadier than he felt. The dispatcher confirmed a mobile unit 10 minutes out. Ryan looked down at the puppies nestled inside his coat. 2 were starting to wriggle, tiny paws kneading against his shirt. The third one, the smallest, hadn't moved. Its chest rose and fell in barely perceptible rhythm, each breath a fragile thing that might be the last. He thought of Daniel. He thought of the folded flag his mother kept in a glass case in the hallway, untouched for 4 years. He thought of how many times he'd walked past it without stopping, without letting himself feel the weight of what it represented. Luna rested her head on the edge of the passenger seat, her eyes meeting Ryan's in the rearview mirror. She was still bleeding, still hurt, but she wasn't looking at her own wounds. She was looking at the puppies, at the 3 lives she'd fought to save. Ryan's throat tightened. He whispered, his voice rough with something he hadn't let himself feel in years, not again. This time he wasn't walking away. This time, he was staying until every single one of them made it through. For 20 minutes, one tiny heart refused to beat, and Ryan stood in the sterile hallway of Peak Valley Emergency Veterinary Clinic, watching through the observation window as Dr. Carla Jensen worked over the smallest puppy with the kind of focused intensity that made the rest of the world disappear. The puppy lay on a heated pad under surgical lights, its body so small it almost vanished under Dr. Jensen's hands. She'd already intubated, already administered epinephrine, already performed compressions that looked impossibly gentle yet somehow desperate at the same time. The monitors showed flat lines. No heartbeat, no electrical activity, just the mechanical hiss of the ventilator pushing air into lungs that weren't responding. Ryan's hands gripped the window frame, his knuckles white, his breath fogging the glass. Beside him, Luna sat on the floor, her shoulder freshly bandaged, her eyes fixed on the same window. She hadn't eaten, hadn't moved except to follow Ryan from room to room. The clinic staff had tried to separate them, to take Luna back for observation, but she'd refused, planting herself at Ryan's side with the kind of determination that made arguing pointless. Dr. Jensen switched from compressions to another injection, her movements smooth despite the urgency. Ryan could see her lips moving, counting under her breath, keeping time. 21 minutes. 22. The other 2 puppies were stable, tucked into incubators in the next room, their body temperatures slowly rising. But this one, the smallest, the one who'd been buried deepest in the snow, kept slipping further away. Ryan felt the familiar weight settling onto his shoulders, the same weight he'd carried since Daniel died. The weight of not being enough, of arriving too late, of standing on the outside of tragedies he couldn't stop. His jaw tightened. He forced himself to keep watching, to not turn away, because turning away felt like giving up, and he'd promised himself he was done giving up. At 23 minutes, the monitor beeped. Once, a single blip of green light cutting across the flat line. Dr. Jensen froze, her eyes snapping to the screen. Another beep. Irregular, weak, but there, a heartbeat. She adjusted the oxygen flow and continued compressions, her expression unchanged but her shoulders lowering just slightly, tension releasing in increments. The rhythm steadied. Slow, fragile, but steady. Ryan exhaled, a sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest, and Luna's tail thumped once against the linoleum floor. Dr. Jensen looked up, catching Ryan's eyes through the window, and nodded. Just a small movement, no smile, no celebration, but acknowledgement. The puppy was alive. Ryan slid down the wall and sat on the floor beside Luna, his hand finding the soft fur behind her ears. She leaned into him, her weight warm and solid against his side. They stayed like that for a long time, watching through the window as the smallest puppy's chest rose and fell, each breath a victory neither of them had expected to witness. That night, Ryan didn't go home. He pulled a chair into the observation room and stayed until morning, and when the sun came up, he was still there. The camera didn't blink. It saw everything. Ryan sat in the clinic's small office, his eyes fixed on the laptop screen where security footage from a home 2 miles south of the highway played in grainy black and white. The timestamp read January 14, 2023, 30:11 p.m. A red pickup truck with a damaged front bumper pulled into the driveway of a single-story rental house with peeling paint and a chain-link fence. A man stepped out, mid-30s, heavy build, wearing a canvas work jacket and boots that matched the prints Ryan had found in the snow. The man opened the truck's rear gate and reached inside, pulling out a cardboard box. Luna appeared in the frame, her movements stiff and protective, positioning herself between the man and the box. The man shoved her aside with his boot. Luna stumbled but didn't back down. She lunged, teeth bared, and the man kicked her again, harder this time, hard enough that she yelped and fell. He grabbed the box and walked toward the side gate, disappearing from view. Luna got up slower now, limping, and followed. Ryan's hands curled into fists. He forced himself to keep watching. The footage jumped forward, timestamp now reading 30:47 p.m. The man returned without the box, climbed into the truck, and drove away. Luna didn't follow this time. She stood in the driveway, staring in the direction the truck had gone, then turned and limped toward the road. The footage ended. Ryan leaned back, his jaw tight, and looked at Deputy Martinez, who'd brought the files over from the county database. "We got a name?" Ryan asked, his voice flat. Martinez nodded. "James Cordell. Former tenant at that address. Evicted 3 months ago for non-payment. Left the dog behind when he moved. Landlord reported it, but Cordell never showed to reclaim her. Animal control couldn't locate him." Martinez slid another document across the desk. 2 domestic violence charges, both dismissed. Restraining order filed by his ex-girlfriend last year. Pattern of control, escalation, then disappearance when consequences showed up. Ryan scanned the file, his chest tightening with each line. This wasn't random cruelty. This was something darker. Cordell hadn't just abandoned Luna, he'd come back. He'd taken her puppies and tried to erase them, to remove the evidence of her existence, in a way that mirrored how abusers erase the people they claim to love. Luna hadn't just been protecting her puppies. She'd been escaping a cycle that would have killed her and them both. Ryan thought of the way Luna had stood in the middle of the highway, refusing to move until someone saw her. She hadn't been blocking traffic. She'd been demanding witness. Forcing someone to acknowledge what had been done. He looked through the office doorway to where Luna lay curled in her crate, her bandaged shoulder rising and falling in steady rhythm. She wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor who'd fought her way out and dragged her babies with her, even when it meant bleeding onto asphalt and trusting a stranger with a badge. Martinez cleared his throat. "We've got a warrant out for Cordell. Last known address is a motel outside Breckenridge. We'll have him in custody by tonight." Ryan nodded, but his focus stayed on Luna. Justice mattered. Arrests mattered. But what mattered more, what made his chest ache with something he couldn't name, was the fact that Luna had survived. That she'd refused to let her story end in a snowbank on a January afternoon. She'd rewritten the ending herself, one bloody paw print at a time, and Ryan understood for the first time in 4 years what it meant to fight for something beyond survival. It meant choosing to keep going even when the world gave you every reason to stop. Luna had made that choice. And now, sitting in a clinic office with files spread across the desk and a dog sleeping in the next room, Ryan realized he was ready to make that choice too. The courtroom was quiet, but what it carried was heavy. The kind of heavy that pressed against your chest and made breathing feel deliberate. Ryan sat in the gallery, 3 rows back, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the defense table where James Cordell sat in an orange jumpsuit, his expression blank, his shoulders slumped in a posture that might have looked like remorse if you didn't know what he'd done. Luna wasn't there. The judge had ruled that animals couldn't be present during trial proceedings, but Ryan felt her absence like a missing piece, a gap in the room's balance. Beside him, Dr. Jensen sat with a folder of veterinary records, her testimony scheduled for after lunch. Across the aisle, a teenager named Marcus Webb shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests, his mother's hand resting on his shoulder. Marcus had been the one to install the security camera at the rental house. He'd done it as part of a school project on neighborhood safety, never imagining his footage would end up as Exhibit A in an animal cruelty trial. The prosecutor, a woman named Elena Vargas with gray, streaked hair and a voice that carried without rising, called Marcus to the stand. He walked slowly, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor, and took his seat. His voice was quiet at first, barely audible, but it steadied as he described what he'd seen that January afternoon. "I was checking the camera feed because my teacher wanted us to document a week's worth of activity," Marcus said, his eyes flicking toward Cordell, then away. "I saw the truck pull up. I saw him take the box from the back, and I saw what he did to the dog when she tried to stop him." Elena Vargas let the silence sit for a moment before asking, "What did you do next?" Marcus swallowed. "I called 911, but by the time they sent someone he was already gone." Ryan watched the jury. 12 faces, some impassive, some visibly affected. One woman in the front row had her hand pressed to her mouth. Another man stared at Cordell with the kind of cold focus that needed no words. Dr. Jensen took the stand after Marcus. She walked the jury through Luna's injuries, fractured ribs, deep lacerations, hypothermia. Then she described the puppies. 2 had survived with moderate intervention. The third, the smallest, had been clinically dead for 23 minutes before resuscitation. "In my 15 years of veterinary practice," Dr. Jensen said, her voice steady but weighted, "I have never seen an animal endure that level of trauma and still fight to protect her offspring." Luna's injuries suggest she was kicked repeatedly. Her paw pads were torn from digging through frozen ground. She traveled over 2 miles in sub-zero temperatures while bleeding internally, and she did it to lead someone back to her puppies before it was too late. The courtroom stayed silent. Elena Vargas didn't need to add anything. The facts spoke in a language that transcended legal jargon. When Cordell's defense attorney stood to cross-examine, he tried to introduce doubt. "Isn't it possible the dog was injured in some other way? That the timeline doesn't match?" Dr. Jensen didn't hesitate. "The injuries are consistent with blunt force trauma delivered by a boot. The timeline matches the security footage. And the location where the puppies were found matches soil samples taken from the defendant's truck bed." The defense attorney sat down. Cordell's expression never changed. He stared at the table in front of him, his jaw tight, his hands folded. Ryan wondered if he felt anything at all. If somewhere inside that blank exterior there was shame or regret or just the dull ache of getting caught. The verdict came 2 hours later. Guilty on all counts. 3 counts of animal cruelty, 1 count of abandonment, 1 count of reckless endangerment. The judge sentenced Cordell to 18 months in county jail, a $5,000 fine, and a lifetime ban on owning animals. The gavel struck once, a sound that echoed in the quiet room, and it was over. Ryan stood, his legs unsteady, and walked out into the hallway where late afternoon sun slanted through tall windows. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't come with music or cheering. It was just a gavel strike, and a man led away in handcuffs, and the knowledge that somewhere in a veterinary clinic, 3 puppies were learning to walk on legs that almost never got the chance. Ryan pulled out his phone and texted Dr. Jensen. "How are they?" Her response came 30 seconds later. "Strong? Luna's with them. They're sleeping in a pile." Ryan allowed himself a small smile. He thought of Daniel. He thought of the folded flag. And for the first time in 4 years, he didn't feel the weight of it crushing his chest. He felt something lighter, something close to hope. That night, Ryan drove back to the clinic. He sat on the floor of Luna's recovery room and watched the puppies tumble over each other, their movements clumsy and joyful. The smallest one, the one they'd named Echo because she'd come back from silence, climbed onto Ryan's chest and fell asleep. Luna rested her head on his knee, and Ryan stayed there until the sun came up, because for once, he wasn't walking away. He was exactly where he needed to be. 2 weeks later, a woman walked into Peak Valley Emergency Veterinary Clinic holding a screenshot on her phone, and everything changed again. Ryan was sitting in the recovery room with Echo asleep in his lap when Dr. Jensen knocked on the doorframe, her expression careful, the kind of careful that meant something significant was about to shift. "There's someone here to see Luna," she said quietly. Ryan looked up, his hand pausing mid-stroke along Echo's back. "Ooh," Dr. Jensen hesitated. "She says she's Luna's original owner." Ryan's chest tightened. He stood slowly, settling Echo into her crate beside her siblings, and followed Dr. Jensen into the front lobby. The woman standing by the reception desk was maybe 30, with dark hair pulled into a ponytail and eyes that carried the same exhausted weight Ryan had seen in his own mirror for years. She wore a faded blue jacket and held her phone like it was a lifeline. When she saw Ryan, she straightened, her grip tightening on the device. "I'm Claire Mitchell," she said, her voice steady but fragile underneath. "Luna is mine. I've been looking for her for 3 months." Ryan's mind caught on the name. Mitchell. The same name on Luna's collar. The same name as his brother. "Daniel Mitchell was my husband." Claire continued, reading the question in Ryan's silence. "He died 4 years ago in a training accident. Luna was his K9 partner. After he died, she became mine." Ryan felt the ground shift beneath him. He'd known Daniel had a partner, someone he'd written about in letters but never brought home because deployments kept stretching longer. He'd never met her, never even seen a photo. And now she was standing in front of him claiming the dog who'd rewritten the last month of his life. "How did you lose her?" Ryan asked, his voice more controlled than he felt. Claire pulled up the screenshot on her phone, a local news segment about the trial. Luna's photo filled the screen. "I saw this 2 days ago. I've been searching since October. My ex-boyfriend, James Cordell, he took her when I left. I filed reports, checked every shelter within 100 miles, but no one had seen her." She looked toward the recovery room, her eyes shining. "Is she okay?" The news said she was hurt. Dr. Jensen stepped forward. "She's recovering. She'll need ongoing care, but she's stable." Claire exhaled, a sound that carried months of fear releasing all at once. "Can I see her?" Ryan wanted to say no. He wanted to argue that Luna had bonded with him, that the puppies needed stability, that after everything they'd been through, splitting them up felt wrong. But he also saw the way Claire's hands trembled, the way her voice cracked when she said Luna's name. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone who'd been searching. Someone who'd lost just as much as Ryan had. He led Claire to the recovery room. The moment Luna saw her, her entire body changed. Her ears perked. Her tail began wagging with the kind of unrestrained joy Ryan had never seen from her. She crossed the room in 3 limping strides and pressed her head into Claire's stomach, a low whine escaping her throat. Claire dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around Luna's neck, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Ryan stood in the doorway, watching, and felt something inside him crack. Not break. Crack, like ice under pressure, letting something through. Luna belonged to Claire. That was undeniable. But Luna had also saved herself. She'd fought her way out of Cordell's control and led Ryan to the puppies and forced the world to pay attention. She wasn't just a possession to be returned. She was a survivor who'd chosen her own path. Claire looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding her, for saving her." Ryan nodded, his throat too tight for words. Later, after Claire had provided ownership documents and veterinary records, after Dr. Jensen had explained the legal process for reclaiming an animal, Ryan sat alone in the recovery room with the puppies. Echo climbed into his lap again, her tiny paws kneading his shirt. He thought about Daniel, about how his brother had always said that the hardest part of K9 work wasn't the danger. It was learning to let go when the mission ended. Ryan hadn't understood that then. He did now. Luna wasn't his to keep. But she'd given him something irreplaceable. She'd shown him that survival wasn't passive, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was refuse to disappear, that even when the world tried to bury you, you could claw your way back and demand to be seen. Claire adopted the puppies a week later. All three of them. She said she couldn't separate them from their mother, and Luna couldn't separate from them. Ryan helped load their crates into Claire's car, his hands steady, his chest aching but not hollow. As they drove away, Luna looked back through the rear window, her dark eyes meeting Ryan's one last time. He raised his hand. She held his gaze. And then they were gone. Ryan stood in the parking lot for a long time after, the cold biting through his jacket, the sun setting behind the mountains. He didn't feel loss. He felt something closer to completion. Like a circle that had been broken for 4 years had finally, quietly, closed. She had 4. Claire whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of wind moving through pine branches. Ryan stood beside her at the edge of the snowbank, where he'd found the puppies, his hands shoved into his coat pockets, his breath forming small clouds in the February air. They'd returned to the site together, Claire's request, because she needed to see the place where Luna had fought, where her story had pivoted from victim to survivor. Claire held a folder of veterinary records, the same ones she'd shown Ryan weeks ago to prove ownership, but tucked in the back was something Ryan hadn't seen. A breeding certificate from a licensed facility in Denver. Luna had given birth to 4 puppies on December 28, 2022. 4, not 3. Ryan's chest constricted. He turned toward the snowbank, his eyes scanning the area where he'd dug. "Are you sure?" Claire nodded, her fingers trembling as she held out the document. The facility confirmed it. 4 healthy puppies. Cordell picked them up on January 10th. He said he had buyers lined up. Her voice cracked. He lied. He never intended to sell them. He just wanted to hurt me. Ryan's jaw tightened. He looked at the snow, still piled high despite the warmer temperatures. If there had been a 4th puppy, if it had been buried deeper or further from where Luna led him, it might still be here. He pulled out his phone and called the county sheriff's office. Within an hour, a forensic team arrived with ground-penetrating radar and excavation tools. They worked methodically, scanning the area in grid patterns while Ryan and Claire stood at a distance, watching in silence. Luna sat between them, her head swiveling between the snow and Claire's face, as if she understood what they were looking for. As if she'd been waiting for someone to ask. The team found it just before dusk, 20 feet east of the original site, buried under 4 feet of compacted snow and frozen soil, wrapped in the same type of fleece blanket as the others. A puppy, smaller than Echo had been, its body curled in a position that suggested it had died quickly, before the cold could take hold. The technician who unearthed it was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and hands that moved with practiced gentleness. She placed the small form into an evidence bag, sealed it, and carried it to Claire. Claire took it with both hands, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just held the bag and stared at the tiny shape inside, and Ryan saw in her expression something he recognized from his own mirror. Grief that had calcified into something harder. Something that couldn't be cried away. Ryan's mind replayed the moment he'd found the first 3 puppies. The way Luna had pawed at the snow with such urgency. The way she'd refused to leave until he started digging. She'd known. She'd known there were 3 alive and 1 already gone, and she'd made a choice. She'd prioritized the ones who still had a chance. That wasn't failure. That was survival arithmetic. The brutal math of triage that soldiers and medics and K-9 handlers learned to calculate in seconds. Luna had done what Ryan's brother had taught her to do. She'd saved who she could and kept moving. Ryan knelt beside Luna and ran his hand along her back. She leaned into him, her weight solid and warm, and he understood that she wasn't haunted by the 4th puppy. She'd mourned it already, in whatever way dogs mourn, and moved forward because staying meant dying. Humans were the ones who couldn't let go, who circled back to count losses and measure failures. That night, Claire and Ryan sat in the clinic's parking lot in Claire's car, the heater running, the windows fogged. The 4th puppy's remains were being processed by the county coroner for evidence in the expanded charges against Cordell. Claire stared at the dashboard, her hands resting on the steering wheel. "I keep thinking about what Daniel would say," she murmured. "He always told me that K9 work wasn't about being perfect. It was about making the best decision you could with the information you had." She looked at Ryan, her eyes red, rimmed but dry. "Luna made the best decision. She saved 3. That's not failure," Ryan nodded. He thought about the folded flag in his mother's hallway. About the 4 years he'd spent avoiding it, because looking meant confronting the fact that Daniel was gone and he hadn't been there to stop it. Maybe that was the wrong way to measure. Maybe the question wasn't whether you saved everyone. Maybe it was whether you saved anyone at all. "She's a hero," Ryan said quietly. "She did what she was trained to do." Claire smiled, a small fragile thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, she did." They sat in silence for a while longer, the heater humming, the windshield wipers scraping away condensation. Outside, the mountains stood dark against the fading light, indifferent and immovable. But inside the car, 2 people who'd lost the same man in different ways sat together and shared understanding. And somewhere in the clinic behind them, Luna slept with her 3 surviving puppies piled on top of her, their collective heartbeat a rhythm that insisted, despite everything, on continuing. There was no crowd, no cameras, just a tree and a promise. On March 3, 2023, Ryan and Claire stood beneath a young maple tree in the memorial section of Peak Valley Cemetery, the ground still hard from winter, but yielding enough to dig. The cemetery director had granted permission for the burial after Claire explained the situation, her voice steady, her request simple. She wanted the 4th puppy laid to rest with dignity, not as evidence, not as a statistic, as a life that mattered. Ryan held the small wooden box they'd commissioned from a local craftsman. It was cedar, smooth and unvarnished, with brass corners that caught the pale March sunlight. Inside, wrapped in the same fleece blanket it had been found in, lay the remains of the puppy who never got to open its eyes. Claire had named it North, after the direction Luna had traveled to find help, a name that meant guidance, a name that meant home. They lowered the box into the earth together, their hands steady, their movements synchronized in the way people move when ritual holds them upright. Luna sat beside them, her shoulder fully healed now, her coat glossy from weeks of proper care. The 3 surviving puppies, Echo, Ember, and Ash, tumbled in the grass nearby, their play a stark contrast to the solemnity of the moment. But Ryan appreciated the juxtaposition, life and death occupying the same space, neither diminishing the other. Claire placed a hand on the box before they began filling the hole. She didn't say anything out loud, but her lips moved in what might have been a prayer or a promise or just a whispered goodbye. Ryan waited, giving her the time she needed, and when she finally stepped back, he began shoveling soil into the grave. The sound of dirt hitting wood was hollow and final. When the hole was filled, they placed a small granite marker at the head. Claire had chosen the inscription North, beloved 4th, not forgotten. Ryan knelt and traced the letters with his fingers, thinking of the other grave he visited less often than he should. Daniel's headstone was 12 rows over, beneath an oak tree that dropped acorns every fall. Ryan hadn't been able to look at it without his chest seizing for 4 years. But today, kneeling beside North's grave, he felt something shift. Grief didn't disappear, it just learned to coexist with everything else. Claire sat on the grass beside Luna, her hand resting on the dog's head. Daniel used to say that the worst part of K9 work was knowing you couldn't save everyone, she said quietly. He carried every loss, every call that came too late, every person they couldn't reach in time. She looked at Ryan, her eyes clear. "I think that's what broke him in the end. Not the danger, the weight." Ryan understood. He'd carried his own version of that weight since Daniel died. The guilt of not being there. The irrational belief that if he'd just called more often, visited more, somehow sensed the accident before it happened, he could have changed the outcome. But kneeling beside a grave for a puppy he'd never met, he realized how absurd that logic was. You couldn't rewrite the past by punishing yourself in the present. You could only honor it by refusing to let it define the future. Daniel would have been proud of Luna, Ryan said. She did exactly what he trained her to do. She survived. She protected. She didn't give up. Claire's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Yeah, he would have been proud. They stayed until the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the cemetery. The puppies wore themselves out and collapsed in a heap near Luna's feet. Echo, the smallest, crawled into Ryan's lap and fell asleep, her tiny paws twitching in dreams. Ryan stroked her soft ears and felt the steady rise and fall of her breathing. This was what survival looked like. Not dramatic, not loud, just breath and warmth and the simple fact of continuing. Before they left, Ryan walked to Daniel's grave. He stood there for a long time, his hands in his pockets, his breath visible in the cooling air. He didn't say anything out loud. But he made a promise, the same one he'd made in the clinic weeks ago. He wasn't walking away anymore. Not from grief. Not from the hard things. He was staying. He was showing up. And if that meant kneeling in the dirt beside graves for people and animals he couldn't save, then that's what he'd do. Because showing up was the only way to honor the ones who couldn't. Claire waited by the car, Luna and the puppies already loaded inside. When Ryan joined her, she didn't ask where he'd been. She just nodded, understanding passing between them without words. They drove back to the clinic in silence, the mountains rising on either side of the highway, snow still clinging to the peaks. Winter wasn't over yet, but spring was coming, and in the back seat, 3 puppies slept soundly, unaware of the grave they'd left behind or the brother they'd never meet. They only knew warmth and safety and the presence of the mother who'd refused to let them become forgotten. That was enough. That had to be enough. "I almost went back," she said, her voice so quiet Ryan almost didn't hear it over the sound of wind chimes hanging from Claire's porch. They sat on mismatched lawn chairs outside her small rental house, coffee mugs warming their hands, the April sun finally strong enough to melt the last patches of snow in the yard. Luna lay at Claire's feet, her head resting on her paws, her eyes half closed in contentment. The puppies were inside, visible through the window as they wrestled over a rope toy. Claire stared at her coffee, her fingers tight around the ceramic. After Cordell was arrested, after everything came out in court, I almost called him. Ryan didn't respond right away. He knew the shape of that confession. The way trauma bent logic until the dangerous thing started to look like the familiar thing, and familiar felt safer than the unknown. "Why didn't you?" he asked finally. Claire exhaled slowly. "Because I looked at Luna, and I realized she'd fought harder to get away from him than I had." She paused, her jaw tight. She was beaten, starving, half frozen, and she still dragged herself 2 miles to find help. She didn't go back. She didn't make excuses for him. She just left. Her voice cracked. "If a dog could do that, what was stopping me?" Ryan set his mug down and leaned back, his eyes on the mountains visible beyond the tree line. "You did leave," he said quietly. "You left when you took Luna and filed the restraining order. The fact that you thought about going back doesn't erase that." Claire shook her head. "But I thought about it. That's the part that scares me. I know what he is. I know what he did. And still, some part of me wanted to believe he'd change." Ryan understood that too. He'd spent 4 years believing that if he just avoided his grief long enough, it would fade on its own. That time would erase the weight of Daniel's death without him having to confront it. But grief didn't work that way. Neither did trauma. "Change doesn't happen because you want it to," Ryan said. "It happens because someone decides to do the work. And Cordell never decided that. You did." Claire looked at him, her eyes searching. "When did you decide?" Ryan thought about the question. About the moment he'd knelt in the snow and heard a newborn cry. About the 23 minutes he'd stood outside an operating room watching a puppy's heart refuse to give up. About the cemetery and the promise he'd made beside 2 graves. "I think I decided the day I stopped believing I could have saved my brother," he said slowly. "I spent 4 years thinking if I'd just been there, been better, been more, he wouldn't have died. But he died anyway. And punishing myself didn't bring him back, it just made me disappear too." He met Claire's eyes. Luna didn't save those puppies because she was perfect. She saved them because she refused to disappear. That's the only choice that matters. Claire's shoulders lowered, tension releasing in increments. "I'm in therapy now," she said after a long silence. "Twice a week. And I have a protective order that lasts 5 years. I'm doing the work." Ryan nodded. "That's what breaking the pattern looks like. Not perfect, just persistent." They sat in silence after that, the kind of silence that felt complete rather than empty. Inside, the puppies barked, their voices high and joyful. and Luna's ears perked. She rose and trotted to the door, scratching lightly until Claire let her in. Through the window, Ryan watched Luna settle among the puppies, her body curving around them in a protective arc. They climbed on her, tugged at her ears, nipped at her tail, and she tolerated it all with the patience of someone who knew exactly how fragile life was and how fiercely it needed to be guarded. Claire rejoined Ryan on the porch, her coffee refilled, her expression lighter. "I've been thinking about volunteering," she said, "at the domestic violence shelter downtown. They have a program where survivors bring their pets for temporary housing. I thought maybe Luna and I could help with that." Ryan smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in weeks. "I think that's exactly what you should do." Claire looked at him, her eyes steady. "What about you? What's next?" Ryan leaned back, considering. He'd taken leave from the sheriff's department to process everything that had happened. But leave wasn't the same as quitting. He still wore the badge, still believed in the work. "I think I'm going back," he said, but differently. "Not trying to save everyone, just showing up for the ones I can." Claire raised her mug in a small toast. To showing up. Ryan clinked his mug against hers. To showing up. They drank their coffee and watched the mountains and let the April sun warm their faces. And inside, Luna and her 3 surviving puppies slept in a pile on the living room rug, their breathing synchronized, their collective heartbeat a rhythm that insisted on continuing. Not because the past had been rewritten, but because the future refused to be dictated by it. 1 year later the snow returned, but the fear did not. On January 14, 2024, Ryan stood at the edge of State Highway 9, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air, his boots planted in the same spot where Luna had refused to move 12 months ago. The highway looked unchanged. Same asphalt, same snowbanks piled by the plows, same pine trees stretching into the distance. But everything else was different. Ryan wasn't alone this time. Claire stood beside him, Luna at her side, the dog's coat thick and glossy, her eyes bright with health. The 3 puppies, now full-grown and nearly as large as their mother, bounded through the snow nearby, their play exuberant and fearless. Echo, still the smallest, stayed closest to Ryan, her loyalty unwavering since the night she'd slept on his chest in the clinic. Ember and Ash chased each other in wide circles, their barks echoing across the empty road. Ryan knelt and pressed his hand into the snow where he'd dug a year ago. The ground beneath was frozen solid, no trace of the horror that had unfolded here. Nature had erased the evidence, covering it with new snow and new seasons. But memory remained, not as a wound, but as a marker. A place where something terrible had tried to end and something stronger had refused to let it. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Claire said quietly, her hand resting on Luna's head. Ryan nodded. "Feels longer and shorter." He stood, brushing snow from his gloves. Both at the same time. Claire smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. "I got a call from the shelter yesterday. They want to expand the pet program. They're naming it after Luna." Ryan's chest warmed. "That's perfect." Claire's expression softened. "I told them only if Luna gets to be there for the ribbon cutting. She's the one who showed people what survival looks like." Luna's tail wagged once, as if she understood. Ryan thought about the past year. The way he'd returned to work with the sheriff's department, but requested assignment to community outreach instead of patrol. The way he'd started visiting schools to talk about K-9 units and animal welfare. The way he'd finally gone to therapy, sitting in an office with a woman who didn't flinch when he cried about Daniel. The way he'd stopped avoiding his mother's hallway and started spending Sunday dinners with his parents, the folded flag still in its case, but no longer a thing they all pretended not to see. Growth hadn't been linear. Some days were harder than others. Some mornings he woke up and the weight was still there, pressing on his chest, whispering that he wasn't enough. But those days were fewer now, and on the days when the weight returned he had tools. He had people. He had a phone full of photos of 3 puppies learning to walk, and a scarred German shepherd who'd taught him that survival wasn't passive. It was a choice you made every single day. "I went to the cemetery last week," Claire said, breaking the silence. "To North's grave. I brought flowers." Ryan looked at her, waiting. "I realized something while I was there," she continued. "I used to think remembering meant staying stuck, like if I moved forward I'd be leaving North behind. leaving all the hard parts behind. She paused, her breath catching. But standing there, I understood that remembering and moving forward aren't opposites. You carry the people and the losses and the hard parts with you. They just get lighter the more you walk. Ryan's throat tightened. He thought of Daniel, of the way his brother's laugh used to fill a room, of the way he'd taught Ryan to tie knots and read maps and stay calm when everything went wrong. Those memories weren't lighter yet, but they weren't crushing him anymore either. They were just part of the landscape he moved through. Part of the story that made him who he was. Echo trotted over and pressed her nose into Ryan's gloved hand. He scratched behind her ears, and she leaned into him, her weight solid and trusting. "You ever think about adopting one of them?" Claire asked, nodding toward the puppies. Ryan had thought about it every day for the past year. But he'd also known that Claire needed them more. That Luna and her puppies were a unit that shouldn't be broken unless absolutely necessary. "I think they're exactly where they need to be," Ryan said finally. Claire studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "You know you're welcome to visit any time. They're part your story, too." Ryan nodded, his chest full. "I know." They stayed a while longer, watching the sun climb higher, turning the snow into fields of light. Cars passed occasionally, their drivers unaware that this stretch of highway had once been a crime scene. That a dog had stood here and refused to let a tragedy go unwitnessed. That 3 puppies had been pulled from the snow and given a second chance. That 2 people who'd lost the same man in different ways had found each other in the aftermath and learned to build something new from the wreckage. When they finally turned to leave, Ryan glanced back one more time. The snowbank looked peaceful, ordinary. Just another curve of white against the tree line. But he knew what it represented, not an ending, a beginning. The place where Luna had made a choice. Where Ryan had made a choice. Where the cycle of silence and disappearance had been broken by the simple, stubborn act of refusing to give up. He climbed into his truck, Echo jumping into the passenger seat beside him, and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, he watched Claire load Luna and the other 2 puppies into her car, their tails wagging, their bodies relaxed. He watched until they pulled onto the highway and disappeared around the bend. Then he put his truck in gear and drove toward town, the mountains rising on either side, the sky impossibly blue. Somewhere in his chest, where the weight used to live, there was space now. Space for breath and memory and the quiet knowledge that he'd done what his brother had always taught him to do. He'd shown up. He'd stayed. And when the world had tried to bury something worth saving, he'd dug until he found it. That was enough. That would always be enough.